Good morning, everyone. Let me start by welcoming you all to this event. And I can see there are a few faces from NCR, but there are many external guests as well, so a very warm welcome. The seminar today is on a very interesting and topical issue. Those of you who read our seminar announcement can already see that there are a few changes. Two of the speakers and chairs could not make it, both due to medical issues. But fortunately for us, Dr. Ratna Sahai was in town, and she kindly agreed to chair the seminar today. I think it's also a good time for me to introduce Dr. Sahai, who has just joined us as a professor at NCER. She has had a distinguished career at the IMF in Washington, D.C., working on many different countries, regions, issues. A lot of those issues span macroeconomics. She has been a very well-published researcher. She has led policy dialogues. She has worked in senior management positions at the IMF. And her most recent passion is working at the intersection of gender and macro, on which she did pioneering work at the IMF, and some of this work she'll continue here at NCER. With that, actually, I'll hand over the proceedings to Dr. Sahai, who will chair this panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Poonam, for that wonderful, wonderful introduction. Let me just first welcome all of you. You know, I've been away for so long from India, and it's such a delight just to look at only Indian faces. It's a real pleasure to join NCER. I know Poonam for a very long time, and you know, I was really excited to work here. So let me just introduce very briefly the lay of the land, the logistics, and the speakers. So this seminar is for an hour and a half. The main presentation will be for about 20-30 minutes or so. And then we will have Dr. Gupta. Dr. Gupta and Dr. Gulati are discussants, so they'll each take about 15 minutes as discussants. Before we start, let me present Dr. Marcos Ribeiro. For me to introduce him is a double pleasure. I should say triple. Triple because I was at the IMF, and now I'm hosting. That's the first reason. The second reason, I'm at the NCER, and this is one of the first public tasks that I do. And the third reason is that the topic he's presenting is also very close to my heart. And it's really an important topic. And I have to say, I read the paper, and there are so many interesting results and facts that I was not aware of, even though I worked on many countries, many fiscal issues. So I'm sure you're going to find it very, very interesting. So Dr. Ribeiro is a Deputy Division Chief in the IMF's Fiscal Policy and Surveillance Division of the Fiscal Affairs Department. He has previously held positions in the IMF's Research, Fiscal Affairs, and African departments. He's also served as a resident representative in Gabon, in Africa, for 4 years, where he gets really good practical experience on a day-to-day basis. He has a PhD from the University of Amsterdam, and he's also published in leading academic and policy-oriented publications. Dr. Gupta, of course, needs no introduction. Actually, I don't even remember, Poonam, but we wrote a paper together. I think we just wrote one paper, and it came out in one of the top 3 journals. So since then, our bonds have been strong. We've become friends too. So I was really delighted when she was selected as the Director General of NCAER. And of course, to me, it's very impressive that she's a member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister. And I must confess that was an attraction to me, which means that whatever work we do, Poonam carries that message. I'm not going to say too much more, but she, of course, has also published widely. She specializes in macroeconomics, focusing on emerging markets. She was the lead economist for global macro and market research at the IFC, and has worked very closely on India and in India, while in India, but also at the World Bank. And Dr. Gulati, I'm really delighted to see him again after a long time. And he's currently a distinguished professor at ICRIER, that I'm sure you know of. Before that, he was the chairman of the Commission for Agricultural Cost and Prices for the Government of India. He was an independent director of the Central Board of Directors of the Reserve Bank of India, National Bank for Agriculture and Rural Development, the NABARD, as you know, and National Commodity and Derivatives Exchange Limited. He's now a member of the 10th Audit Advisory Board of the Controller and Auditor General of India, and also an independent director of the Board of Directors of Kotak Mahindra Bank Limited and Godrej Agrovet Limited. He was also a director at IFPRI for more than 10 years, and had previously served as the Economic Advisory Council of the Prime Minister, Shri Atal Bihari Vajpayee. And you can imagine how much experience, both in research and policy, he has on India. So I think he's going to focus more on bringing an Indian perspective, and Poonam probably both, I don't know. Let's wait to hear. So before further ado, let me ask Marcos to go ahead and give us his presentation. Thank you, Marco.
Works? Yes. So I think I would prefer to stand up. So first of all, thank you so much for having me here. It's also a pleasure in 3 ways to be here. The first one, it's a great for me, for our Fiscal Affairs Department in the International Monetary Fund. It's a great pleasure to be in India. It's a great pleasure to be in the NCAER with Dr. Gupta and present our work here. Second, I was really surprised to see Ratna here. So it's a big pleasure, someone that has been in the IMF, has such a name in the IMF. We never cross it for some reason, but it's really a pleasure. It's really great. And the third reason is actually a personal reason. Being a national from Brazil, I think, we are always very connected to India. It's my first time in India. So it's really a big pleasure to be presenting here in New Delhi. Really great to see you all. So we are going to be presenting today our analytical chapter of the Fiscal Monitor. So in the fund, as most of you know, we have 3 flagships. We have the World Economic Outlook. I worked there in the past. We have the Global Financial Stability Report from our money and capital markets. Ratna has been there for a long time. And we have the Fiscal Monitor in the Fiscal Affairs Department that looks at global fiscal issues, right? And we have a conjunctural chapter, which I invite you to read, and an analytical chapter. So this time, when we were preparing the analytical chapter back, I would say, in July 2022, we were thinking, well, what should we write about? And for us, it was clear that we should write about the relationship between inflation and fiscal policy. We are facing the largest upsurge in inflation around the world of the last 3 to 4 decades, right? Many countries that are not used to inflation and therefore don't understand perhaps all the intertwined relationship between inflation and fiscal policy. So we thought that a chapter discussing this intertwined relationship would be important. Now, why intertwined relationship? Because on one hand, inflation may affect fiscal policy through how it affects like public wage, through how it affects like revenues. On the other hand, fiscal policy may have an impact on inflation through the fact that it has in aggregate demand, through the fact that it may have in inflation expectations. So we wrote this chapter. This is a combined work with the team that you see here, a wonderful team from our Fiscal Affairs Department. And I should say that like the views expressed on the presentation are personal views, so I'm using the disclaimer, while of course the chapter represents staff views on the topic. So we had, as I said, 3 questions for the chapter. The first, as I said, looking at one side of the causality, how inflation affects fiscal variables. The second, which is connected, which is like, what are the distributive effects of inflation? And I hope to show you, for emerging economies, sometimes we understand this better than Western economies, but we have actually some interesting results that may be interesting for us here in the room as well. And third, then looking to the other side of the causality, how fiscal policy, so the question, what's the role of fiscal policy has on fighting inflation, right? And which is a big hot topic, as you can imagine, in many economies right now. So we started the chapter with the first question. Given that I have 30 minutes, I'm going to pass through some of the slides relatively quickly, but we have an initial discussion on the chapter, a theoretical description of what are the main channels through which inflation shocks affects fiscal variables, particularly at the immediate shock at the first year. So, and we summarize this in our executive summary through this infographic that you can watch here on the screen. So we have actually basically 4 main categories. So you have like the inflated nominal value. So when inflation hits the economy, basically it increases your nominal GDP, nominal prices are going up. It affects as well your tax base in nominal terms. So you have this GDP denominator effect, and a lot of our fiscal variables are ratios of GDP. So this denominator effect may reduce the ratio almost automatically, and you also have your tax base increasing in nominal terms, which is like, for some of us, clear to understand, for some others not. Then we have indexation, and this is quite interesting. The next slide is gonna discuss about that. Very important topic to discuss. I will let for the next slides. You have the third point, the structure of your sovereign debt. For example, if part of your debt is linked to inflation of your bonds, automatically you have an effect when inflation goes up. But that's not only the only way. If you have more foreign debt or less foreign debt or more domestic debt, inflation will affect you through the exchange rate depreciation in a different way. And in the chapter, we discuss all these mechanisms through each effect. Finally, you have market expectations. Inflation hit the economy, and that may affect bond spreads. It may affect investors. And through this effect on bond spreads, you also may have like an increase on that just because like there is more uncertainty. Inflation is bringing uncertainty to the economy. So we discuss this in detail in the chapter, and I invite you to read. I'm not going to go in detail, but the infographic is there. So I will start looking a bit more in detail on an important topic, which is indexation. So for indexation, what we did in the chapter, we took advantage of being in the IMF, where every single country has a country team, Hatna knows as well, and we did 2 things. We first went through G20 documents, and we tried to understand for each one of these 4 variables, personal income tax brackets, pension, social assistance programs, and public wages, what is the current status around the world in terms of indexation to inflation. So we went through several documents of the G20, and then we complemented that to a question for all our country desks in the IMF, asking exactly the same question. Please tell me on these 4 categories of fiscal variables, what is the current situation in the country you're working in terms of indexation, right? And this is very important because, some things are very clear to us. If you have public wage indexation, there you go, spending goes up, automatically, maybe with a lag, but automatically because public wages are going up. with the inflation. Some others are not so clear, and that's the tax brackets indexation, perhaps one of the subtle ways to, that the government has to let inflation affect fiscal variables. How? If you have inflation and nominal wages are increasing with inflation, if you don't change tax brackets, all of a sudden you make people moving the threshold of income tax, and you are collecting more revenues just because you're quietly, nobody saw it, nobody heard, you just didn't touch that threshold, you didn't adjust that threshold to inflation, and there you have fiscal policy acting in a very hidden way. So we look at the status, and the interesting result that we found from this, we got like data for 116 countries, 276 country members of the IMF, and what we find is like indexation nowadays varies significantly across countries. So the pink component here of the bars is basically no indexation, and the green component is indexation to inflation, and the other colors, some other type of indexation, think about minimum wages. So what we see is actually tax brackets, as I just said, not so much indexation, not so much adjustment, automatic adjustment to inflation. So this revenue effect that I'm mentioning, quite prevalent in many countries. What we see the most in terms of like indexation is indexation to pensions, okay? With most of them in advanced economies, 40% of the countries that we surveyed have indexation to inflation, but also like more than 90% of advanced economies having some sort of indexation in the country, right? In emerging economies, also indexation to pensions is quite important, but much less prevalent, as you can see, compared to advanced economies. Second item is social assistance programs, with advanced economies having a large effect, but EMs and low income in developing countries, much less. So if inflation is hitting hard our emerging markets, we have to be aware that actually the social assistance programs are not, being updated in line with inflation. And surprisingly, at least for me, public wages, not so much indexation. I think the experience of this low inflation, long low inflation period in many countries, of course, there are many countries, and we can discuss in the debate, these big countries with like large inflation, but given that large part of the world didn't have inflation for a while, indexation to public wages was not prevalent. This may change now, and we see that discussion, that political discussion taking place in several places in the world. UK is one example, but there are many others, where there will be this, if inflation remains persistent, there may be this pressure to index wage to inflation. So then we go to the econometrics of the first section, and on the econometrics, we try to understand, given inflationary shock, what is the effect in main fiscal variables. And here, I'm not going to have time to discuss all the variables, but I focus in one that's the most important, debt, right? And what we saw is actually inflationary shock, and we did several econometric results for a sample of 85 countries. Historically, since 1962, inflation has a significant and negative effect on debt, in reducing debt. So we look at that, we were like, wow, and that's quite robust. So we were kind of surprised that inflation, at least for a Brazilian, was quite surprised. So we said, let's understand a bit better what is leading to this reduction in debt when you have the inflationary shock. And that's what this slide shows. So we, after having this general effect, which is our first figure in the chapter, we broke down inflation into components: unexpected inflation and expected inflation. And what we found is actually that the unexpected, the surprising component of inflation, I was not expecting, I asked markets, they didn't forecast that level of inflation. It does have, particular for countries with large debt, a very significant and persistent over the medium term negative effect on debt, right? So it does reduce debt, and it reduces debt in both ways. It reduces debt because of the denominator effect, the fact that the GDP in nominal terms is increasing with inflation, but also, I'm going to show in the next slides, we also have this temporary overall balance improvement, and I'll explain in a second why, right? Now, the interesting thing and the important thing from the policy perspective is actually look at the expected inflation, much less significant effect. So actually not significant at all for countries with like a large debt, and borderline significant, if any, for countries with low debt. So the message here is clear. Trying to reduce debt through inflation is going to backfire if you make inflation persistent and if you make inflation expected. And that's what happens in a lot of like emerging markets that have large inflation. Happened in my country when I was like a student in the high school, for example, right? So don't try to keep surprising bondholders and the economy with inflation, because that may backfire over time. So on the overall balance, so we look at the different types of variables. Again, I won't have time. I invite you to look at the chapter. We look also at different frequencies of data, annual and quarterly. Here I'm presenting the results of quarterly. So I'm just like a focus here in one result that sometimes we don't understand, and sometimes it's very interesting for fiscal authorities to understand. And that is like the significant effect of like inflationary shock in overall balance. And the significant effect of like inflation on overall balance is caused by two factors. First, and this is all in ratios of GDP. First, revenues is going up with inflation. As I discussed it, the tax base in nominal terms, increasing prices go up, you consume the goods, you pay more taxes. Now, the interesting point is how sticky expenditure is. And why is that? Because in a first year, think about the first year of surprise inflation. I have passed a budget. The budget is actually in rupees. It's not in percent of GDP. And that budget, if there is no amendment to it, it becomes a nominal ceiling. I'm allowed to spend, I don't know, 1 billion rupees in a particular item. If inflation goes up, right, that 1 billion rupees will be eroded in real terms, particularly also in percent of GDP, just because my budget is set in nominal terms. So there is this stick and temporary effect. It's quite temporary. Here is in quarters, we find in 1 or 2 years as well a temporary decline as percent of GDP of this inflationary shock, but it's enough to contribute to the reduction in debt. So, and I think it's important that we understand this component. Then we go to the second question on the distribution effects of inflation. And here, some surprising results, at least for me again, that come up. So we look at 3 channels on how inflation may affect incomes of the households and the distribution of income through these households. We look at the classical consumption basket channel. I'm a household, I'm like a low-income household. My basket depends a lot on, I consume a lot of food. Food prices went up more than the average inflation. I'm more penalized than someone that's instead buy services or buy cars or buy more durable goods, right? So that's what we kind of think. We also look at real incomes. So how adjusted to inflation, wages, pensions, social assistance programs are, and as I showed, this may have an effect. If my wage was not adjusted to inflation, I'm worse off than someone that was overly adjusted or was adjusted to inflation. So that's the income channel that we say. And then the third, which is also quite innovative in our analysis, we believe, is this balance sheet channel of the household. So if I'm a net creditor, I have borrowings. So suppose I have a mortgage in a house where I have a large credit, consumption credit, that's normally set in nominal terms. Every month I pay my house a certain amount in dollars or in rupees. That amount won't change. So if inflation goes up, if my wage is adjusted to inflation somehow, that amount in nominal terms is eroded. So actually better off, right? Now, if I'm a net creditor and I have an asset, it will depend a lot on type of asset and how adjusted to inflation that asset is. If I only hold cash, we know that here in India, we know that in Brazil, that value is eroded, right? So the 1 rupee or the 100 rupee that I hold, it doesn't mean much anymore, like say 3-6 months later. If I hold as properties, it will depend on how this property price is adjusted to inflation. If it's not adjusted, I'm worse off. If it's more than adjusted, I'm better off, right? So we look at this. This is quite interesting as well. For all types of economies, Colombia, so we take 6 cases, Colombia, Finland, France, Kenya, and Senegal. So 2 advanced economies, 2 emerging markets, and 2 low-income countries. And we use like a household survey, thousands of observations to try to understand how these 3 channels affect the economy. So here, I'm going to pass very quickly. This is the first effect, the consumption basket channel. Very interesting in this chart. So you have Kenya here. Let's focus on Kenya and in Finland. On Kenya is the classical low-income emerging market type of effect. Lower poor Kenyans in the 20 percentile lower income, their basket depends a lot on food. Food prices were the most affected. The perceived inflation for this group is much larger than the average inflation, which is the red line, okay? Particularly if combined with the other products. Now, for an advanced economy like Finland or France, which is also hardly hit by inflation, how surprising, like first food doesn't matter too much for them. And that's quite interesting to understand already. They consume a lot in their baskets energy and transportation goods. So the prices, and for Europe, the energy price was a big component of their shock given the war in Ukraine, they were like heavily affected. But very flat. As you can see here, you don't see this decaying effect between rich and poor, as you see in Kenya. You don't see that in Finland. You see a very flat type of effect of this consumption basket channel. So every single household is being affected more or less for different reasons, perhaps like the richest households more on transportation than on fuel, on electricity, but in the same, more or less in the same value as the poorest households. So very interesting to see this cross-country comparison. Then we go to the 3 channels, and we discuss this a lot, much more in detail in the chapter, and what we see, for Kenya, a classical example, for Kenya we don't have the balance sheet, very difficult to find balance sheet for low-income countries, but what we find there is like this declining effect in terms of wealth and in terms of like the distribution effect of inflation. The poor households are mostly affected. They are mostly affected by the consumption channel. They are also very similar affected by the income channel, which means that their wage were not adjusted fully to inflation, right? All types of households more or less affect the same, but given that you add this to the consumption channel, the poorest households in Kenya, the inflation affecting the poorest is the interesting example. Now, when you go to Finland, very different story. And here, again, so we have the 3 channels. It's interesting to see that the poor is still the most affected. Is the most affected because of this income effect. So in Finland, there was not this like adjusted to wages from inflation, but the consumption, which is the red line, very marginal. So the consumption basket doesn't matter to them. They can afford, and they were not heavily affected through that channel. What matters is their balance sheet and how their balance sheet is affected. And it turns out that the very poor in Finland, or the poorest in Finland, they hold a lot of like liquid assets, deposits. And deposits in banks were not adjusted to inflation, right? Interesting as well, the very rich in Finland, they were also like more affected than the middle class, than, for example, this 4th quartile. And why? Because these very rich Asians in Finland, they are net creditors. They own assets, and their assets were not adjusted to inflation or very much in line with the inflation adjustment, so the orange part component here is very small. Now, the effect for the middle class is smaller. And why is that? It's smaller because these middle class are the net debtors. So they are the ones that are holding the mortgage that I gave the example, and they are benefiting, at least in their balance sheet, from this inflation effect. This can even be more interesting seen on the relationship with age. Net debtors tend to be young households. Net creditors tend to be old households, we look at like a different age brackets, and what we find is like for each income quintile, depends if you are in the poorest in the income quintile or in the richest income quintile, the young in these different income quintiles always benefit from the inflation or through this wealth channel, and the poorest and the oldest are always more affected for inflation than the youngest. So there is this redistribution between net creditors to net debtors. There is this redistribution from the old people to the young people when inflation hits the economy, and that's a result that perhaps not everybody was fully aware. So let me move on, and then I go to the final point, which is like how fiscal policy may affect inflation. Here, we had like basically two questions. It is surprising, Ratsna, I can say because you were in the building, but 1 year ago, if you would say, well, part of this inflation is caused because of fiscal policy, some people would say, yes, of course. Some people in the building say, wait a minute. How fiscal policy can affect inflation? Inflation is a monetary phenomenon, and we heard that, and like this is a supply shock, so very difficult to show or to discuss that part of the inflation could be coming from fiscal policy. So in the first part of this section, we analyze econometrically if that's the case, if fiscal policy has an effect on inflation. The second component, once we establish this relationship, then we try to understand, well, so if fiscal policy matters for inflation, how we then can do in this interplay with monetary and fiscal policy interactions to help inflation. So let me go quickly on the empirical results. We use it nowadays very standard, like identification strategies, very typical econometric exercise. Here, for example, we are using Valerie Ramey news on military shocks, which is a very traditional way to identify fiscal shocks in the economy. And the interesting thing is all these papers are estimating multipliers. I have a couple of them. We are all very interested about fiscal multipliers in recent years, but nobody asked it, but what was the effect of inflation? There was no inflation, so nobody asked that question. We asked it, we add inflation to this structure of VAR. And guess what happened? Very significant, here is for the US, inflation, a 1 percentage point increase in spending, leading to a 0.5 percentage points in inflation. So if you have an increase of like 10 percentage points of GDP in spending, you're going to have 5 percentage points increase in inflation just automatically in the US, according to these estimates. We also analyzed this for a bigger sample of advanced economies, 17 advanced economies, and again, the very similar result. We split the sample in two periods, 1950 to 85, so when monetary policy perhaps was less credible, to a period after 86 where monetary policy was more credible, where there was a great moderation. And again, historically, before 86, a very large and significant impact of fiscal spending on inflation, right? And you use signed restrictions. This is the econometric way to do it. For the more recent periods, it's still quite significant and like quite persistent in numbers of like 2-3 years that a fiscal spending affects inflation. Again, with the 0.5 estimate, a 1 percentage point increase in spending leading to a 0.5. So even for a larger sample, with a different type of technique, we find the same results. So then we come with the final thing of the chapter is like, okay, let's understand then what role fiscal policy has to play to help economy. So we use a very modern state-of-art model, is a heterogeneous Asian, New Keynesian model. So the big advantage of this heterogeneous agent, very difficult to solve, but the interesting component of this heterogeneous agent of like a typical New Keynesian model is actually it has income distribution. So beyond of the facts on aggregate consumption, on aggregate output, I can also understand how shocks, policy shocks in this model affects income distribution of the agents, right? So, so we did 3 exercises, and I will finalize here. The first exercise, we said, okay, let's in this model, we have a high inflation, let's bring inflation down by only using monetary policy by overshooting the interest rate that a Taylor rule would ask you to use to bring inflation down. So let's jack up interest rates quite a lot so we bring inflation down. The two other exercises, we said, let's keep the Taylor rule, so let's keep like a gradual increase in interest rates, but let's use as well fiscal consolidation to help monetary policy in disinflating the economy. And we do that in two ways. We say, we do fiscal consolidation independent of which instrument we do. So we bring the overall balance 1% of GDP lower. But in the third exercise, we say, no, let's do something smarter. Let's bring the fiscal consolidation 1% of GDP lower, but I consolidate more on other spending categories, okay, transfers, subsidies, and I give 0.5% of GDP for the poorest, for the most affected through this inflationary shock, okay? So I'm helping the poorest that is being affected. So what are the results very, very quickly? When you use the monetary policy, and that's the slide, what we see is actually, as you expected, inflation goes down, aggregate output, you cause a recession in the economy, and that's what everybody's worried, like you cause this huge interest rate, you cause a recession in the economy. But interesting to see in the model is actually here, I'm showing the consumption by income bracket. And the red line is the poorest individuals in the economy. They are the most affected from this large increase in interest rate. And so the income inequality is increasing as I raise interest rates quite a lot to bring inflation down. So it's not that you're causing only the recession, but you're increasing income inequality. Then we go to the two scenarios where you have fiscal policy helping. In the first one, that you're not supporting the poorest through fiscal policy, actually, again, you bring inflation, you bring aggregate consumption down quite a lot, so you have this recession effect, and income inequality also increased quite a lot. So using fiscal policy with monetary policy, not targeting this fiscal policy may also be dangerous for income inequality. However, when you consolidate the fiscal stance at the same time that you support the poor, all of a sudden, you are bringing inflation down by the same amount. The effect on aggregate consumption is much lower, so the recession, if you like, is much lower, and actually, income inequality goes down. Why? Because the poor has the largest marginal propensity to consume. I give money, 100 rupees, they're going to spend automatically. Right? So you are helping the economy by doing that. So I stop here. We have like 4 conclusions. Fiscal policies help inflation shocks, surprise inflation shocks help public debt. But if you keep surprising, and if this inflation becomes persistent, you're not going to surprise anyone anymore, and debt is not going to go down anymore. On the indexation, be aware of the trade-offs. So while some indexation may be good because you also want to retain high-quality workers, so you don't want to, like, the civil servants to be heavily affected by inflation. You want to attract these people to the public sector. You also may cause a more persistent inflation by doing so. So be aware of how much indexation you want to give in the public spending spectrum to avoid this persistent inflation. Finally, the redistributive effects of inflation, much more complex than we thought. So it's not only about like the basket of goods that I consume, it's about like the incomes if they are adjusted, it's about which type of balance sheet me as a household have. Am I a net creditor or am I a net debtor? And then finally, fiscal policy do play a role on affecting inflation. We found this econometrically, and therefore fiscal policy should be part of the package in reducing inflation. It should be part of the package of reducing inflation by being smart and consolidating at the same time that you're supporting the most affected by the cost of living crisis. I stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marco. That was a great, great presentation. And also importantly, you kept exactly on time, which is very, very impressive since I attend many or moderate many sessions. One thing I forgot to mention is that it's about 10:45, and you know, the discussants will take about 30 minutes, so we will have time for questions from the audience, which I'm sure Marcos welcomes very much, because it's very important for him to take back the sense that you have so that it can be incorporated in the work of the IMF. But let me hand over to Poonam now. Poonam.
Thank you. I don't have the host to thank. I'm the host, so I'll just straight away go to. The slides are not coming now. So first, Marcos, that was a fascinating presentation. I read the Fiscal Monitor, both the chapters, though you presented only the second chapter. Incidentally, in a way, this issue of elevated debt levels, you have also covered at the IMF in the World Economic Outlook. I also looked at that. So the issue that you are covering through your flagship reports are very, very relevant in today's world. When inflation is high, after 3 years of COVID and war, public debts are elevated, monetary policies have been tightened very aggressively in some countries, preemptively in some countries, belatedly in others, and there are low-income countries which did not really experience the maximum brunt of these two crises, but they are facing very restricted policy space as well. So my summary of the chapter that you presented, I'm not focusing on the distributional impacts of inflation, which, as you mentioned and is articulated in the chapter, are complex, and it's a function of many different things: age groups, creditor borrowers, income decile, etc. I would rather focus on the summary as is here on the slide. Fiscal deficits, public debts are elevated. They take time to come down. Public debt certainly takes time to decline over a period of time. So around the world, public finances are more stretched and are at higher level than they were prior to COVID. Inflation has emerged as an additional challenge. Inflation is high, still elevated and sticky. I call it more a problem of advanced economies such as US, UK, and EU than of the emerging world or low-income countries. Monetary policy has been deployed to bring inflation down, and we'll look at how it has been deployed around the world. Now, the chapters recommends that monetary policy may not be enough to normalize inflation. So therefore, it may be time to combine it with fiscal consolidation, along with targeted support to protect the most vulnerable populations, so that one can be more effective in bringing inflation down. It cautions that countries should not think of relying on inflation as a way to lower their debt levels, because it works only for a limited time period and under specific circumstances. All the points are well taken. My comments are 5 or 6-fold. Is inflation normalizing, or is it still unacceptably high? And if so, in what kind of economies? Is high public debt a concern? Is the real issue high inflation, high public debt, or both? If it's both, then we need to think of different instruments than if we think only one of the issues are more challenging currently. And is this phenomenon of high inflation, high public debt a general phenomenon, or it applies to select set of countries? Though I have written advanced economies here, but in our discussions, in the discussants' comments, we are looking at really 4 kinds of countries: advanced economies, emerging markets, low-income countries, and what we call special cases. You presented some evidence that consolidating fiscally can bring inflation down. Is there really such a strong analytical and empirical case to do that? Especially when you combine fiscal with monetary. I understand your results are when you are giving one shock at a time, either monetary or fiscal. If you give both the shocks, what happens? Does your economy simply collapse with marginal impacts and benefits on inflation? And the genesis of inflation really matters. If it's a supply side phenomenon, inflation, and you squeeze your fiscal policy, what happens? Practical aspects of tightening fiscal policy are very important. Monetary policy has a certain cycle. Monetary policy gets decided almost every 6 weeks in many, many countries, including the US and India. So there is already a mechanism in which you're taking a call every 6 weeks, whether to raise inflation, interest rates or not. Fiscal policy more or less is decided once in a year. So how do you use it to influence inflation when it's, in real time, when the way monetary fiscal policies are designed is that it's once in a year phenomenon. So answers to these comments are inflation is declining. It has actually come down quite a bit. It still remains above the pre-pandemic level as per the projections by the World Economic Outlook. It will come down further by 2024 and will remain marginally above the pre-pandemic level. Then the question is, should one still be concerned about it to the extent that we want to combine a tight monetary policy with a tight fiscal policy? It's not runaway inflation, except in those exceptional cases that I mentioned. Is high public debt a concern? Certainly in advanced economies. It's a concern around the world, but much more in advanced economies. Low-income countries need debt relief. They cannot consolidate anything. They just need debt relief, period. Emerging markets are in between. Inflation plus debt, is that a general phenomenon, or does it apply to select set of countries? In our analysis, we see that it applies more to advanced economies. They are the ones who could afford to expand fiscally. They are the ones who delayed their monetary policy actions. They are the ones who are facing high inflation, which has come down, but will remain elevated a little bit above their pre-pandemic level even by 2024. So then how do we think about all of these? So some charts and some data. So as I mentioned, inflation has declined, and here we are looking at two sets of countries, advanced economies and emerging market and developing economies together. Inflation is down from the peak levels currently in 2023. They are projected to decline even further. And in emerging markets and developing economies, they are projected, these are IMF projections in the World Economic Outlook. In emerging market and developing economies, they're projected to almost come down to the pre-pandemic levels by 2025, will remain elevated in advanced economies. The question is, where will inflation settle around the world? Is it going to come down to pre-pandemic levels at all? Is it desirable to bring them to the pre-pandemic levels by doing whatever it takes? The case is not clear. So if US had an inflation target of 2% before the pandemic, will it make sense for it to be comfortable with an inflation level of 3–3.5%? Similar questions can be asked for other countries. Closer home in India, we have an inflation range, 2–6%. And with the idea that inflation should be around 4%. But there's nothing written in our inflation targeting framework that it cannot be between 4–6%. So is it now the case that countries should be a little bit more tolerant and not try to bring down inflation to the levels that they had put forth for themselves? There's nothing scientific about it that US should be at 2%. There's nothing scientific about that India should be at 4%. So I think that's the debate that should happen, rather than saying, let's squeeze, monetary policies have been elevated, US 5.25 policy rate. Either take it to whatever level or now fiscally consolidate and bring it down. So I think that's the real question. Now, when we continue to compare countries into different income groups, inflation in advanced economies, and here we have 3 countries, US, UK, and EU, is still coming down from its highs. It actually exceeded the inflation levels in emerging markets. A little bit of a selective sample that I'm showing. Mexico, India, Indonesia, South Africa generally have higher inflation levels than advanced economies, which accelerated during COVID. But the pace of acceleration is much more in advanced economies. So what I'm trying to say is that it has been an advanced economy problem more than that of any other set of countries. Fiscal expansion was much larger in advanced economies, primarily because they are the ones who could afford it. They are the ones who can print money to finance their fiscal deficit. They don't even need any market access. Low-income countries, nobody lends to them. How will they fiscally expand? Emerging markets, they have to be very, very careful because they have a limited market access. So high inflation has been more of an advanced economy problem. Fiscal expansion certainly has been more of an advanced economy phenomenon. And they are the ones who were slower to tighten monetary policy, again, because they could afford to, right? Emerging markets had to jump in right into 2022 and start raising their policy rates aggressively. I do not have Brazil in my sample, and I just learned this morning, Marcos is from Brazil, raised policy rates to 12.5%, 13% levels. You know, so this is brutal for economies. So clearly, I mean, I don't see the case for these emerging markets, both because the inflation is coming down, because the monetary policy was already preemptive and very aggressive, to further tighten their fiscal policies as well. Public debt has always been high in advanced economies because they have that exorbitant privilege that we all know about. Emerging markets are somewhere in between at 60%, slightly higher than the pre-pandemic levels, but again, not runaway public debt. Low-income countries are at 40% average. So it seems to me Fiscal Monitor is conveying a lesson to advanced economies, and if so, you could say so, right? It's a problem of advanced economies, and guys, you need to do something more. So these are just the same charts by countries, specific countries. So inflation has been stickier and still elevated in advanced economies. They are the ones who could afford to expand more fiscally. They did. There were both demand and supply side factors resulting in high inflation. They reacted through tight monetary policies, but they were late in reacting. Again, IMF should have been more forceful on advanced economies. I mean, Marcos, I'm not going to give all the lessons that I have for messages for IMF to you, but they also missed the banking crisis in the US, and you have Article 4 reports with them, right? Just as you have with India. Yeah. So they have very high debt levels too. Might be good for them to consolidate fiscally, which will actually be good for emerging markets, spillovers from their monetary policy tightening, right? They lose and tighten their monetary policies, we have to pick the pieces here. So if they tighten fiscally, yes, there'll be impacts on global demand, but emerging markets will have to worry less about their monetary policy spillovers. Emerging market economies, on the other hand, there was no other way, but given the access that they have to markets to raise financing, they handled fiscal response to COVID more prudently because they didn't have a choice. They tightened monetary policy more aggressively early on. And politically, actually, political sensitivity to inflation and fiscal is very different in advanced economies and emerging markets. I mean, and it's closer home. Inflation is considered to be a bigger discomfort politically than an elevated debt or deficit level. And in the US, it's both, right? There is, and I imagine in other advanced economies as well, there is less political tolerance for inflation as well as expanded public debt. I mean, the issue that we are seeing in the US currently, their debt ceilings about to be reached and what will happen to their debt. So what is the real pathway for emerging markets? It's really to reorient their spending more, to improve their revenues. They have some priorities coming up and they don't have the fiscal room to address those, climate transition being one of them. So I think rather than a blanket that you consolidate fiscally through expenditure, I think the nuances are very important for emerging markets. Low-income countries never had the room to expand fiscally during COVID. The inflation is imported, right? A lot of the inflation is imported. The debt is elevated because of exchange rate depreciation. They cannot afford to tighten through monetary or fiscal policy, and the payoffs are not clear. What they need is something very different. They need debt relief, they need fresh resources to meet their SDG goals, and they need resources for climate transition. But then there are these exceptional countries: Argentina, Turkey, Sudan, Ukraine, Russia, and now Pakistan and Sri Lanka. They have runaway inflation. Argentina's inflation, if I'm not wrong, is 99%. I do not even have Venezuela here. I think 400% inflation. Now, the messages of the report do not apply to them. They need a full credible package of reforms, prudence, frameworks, right? So we can't say you fiscally consolidate and hey, you can bring down your inflation from 99% to 20%. It's not going to happen. Just a minute or two, Ratna. Conceptual aspects of fiscal consolidation are important. And I have already mentioned to that. Monetary policy has a certain frequency, and therefore it can address cyclical issues much more proactively. There is an announcement mechanism, there is an engagement mechanism. That is not the case for fiscal policy. It makes more sense, therefore, as a medium-term policy tool. Other than that, so suppose hypothetically one agrees that fiscal policy needs to be tightened, then how should it be done? Should it be through expenditure compression, which is what I think you were alluding to more, because raising revenues takes time, right? You have to change your tax design, your tax administration, your non-tax revenues. It doesn't happen at a frequency of a year or two. Even after all the tax reforms you may do or revenue reforms you may do, the lags are much longer than in monetary policy. Monetary policy works with the lag too, but lags of fiscal policy are much longer. So just to sum up, I think it's my last slide. Inflation is declining. It will remain above the pre-pandemic level even by 2024. Is there a case for some patience with these slightly higher inflation levels, given that there is no magic number that any country can come up with, which strikes the right balance between economic prudence and growth? Therefore, should the debate be, what should the new post-pandemic inflation levels be? It would be good to combine monetary policy with fiscal consolidation to bring inflation down only in some of the countries, as per my analysis. Practically, it will be harder even in those countries. Overall, fiscal policy needs to be oriented around the world for better revenue collection and spending towards more emerging priorities such as capital expenditure and climate transition. More true for emerging markets currently. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Poonam. Really thoughtful comments. And of course, a number of your comments go beyond the paper itself, because maybe that triggers some thoughts on how IMF looks at many of these topics. So thank you very much for that. Ashok, since you had kindly volunteered to take 10 minutes, may I ask you to do that? Thank you.
Thanks, Ratna, and thanks, Poonam, for inviting me here. Let me start by complimenting the IMF team for a very comprehensive analysis, very rich over a period of time, as well as the shocks of inflation. The most interesting thing that I found, which Poonam brushed aside, was the distributive effects. Why? For the advanced economies, other effects on wealth, even wages, indexation or not, are a matter of numbers. Your wealth goes a little bit up or down. But when it comes to the poorest lot, it is the consumption basket effect. It's a life and death question. It's a major nutritional damage forever. And that's what I'm going to focus on. You took a sample of 6 countries in that particular thing: Africa, Senegal, and Kenya. And we saw how much damage it does to the lowest, poorest people, both in terms of income, in terms of consumption, or whatever indicators you take. And they don't have enough fiscal space to protect them, actually. So it's a very long-term damage that you do in those countries. You took Finland and France, and then Colombia and Mexico. I wonder why you didn't take anyone from South Asia, at least if not India. The largest concentration of poverty in the world is right here. And two of our neighbors are in deep trouble. So this miss, where inflation is not a number, it's life and death question, matters most for South Asia and Africa. And I think this gap needs to be filled in. I request IMF team to please look into that. And Ratna said, I may talk about India a little bit more. But let me first start with agreeing with IMF paper, Fiscal Monitor, that you need a monetary and a fiscal policy package together to tame inflation. It's very interesting, having been involved with RBI for quite some time. You know, there are extreme monetarists. Everything is monetary. So the only thing they know is interest rate go up and down. And there are many others like yourself who would say, please bring in fiscal policy, and sometimes even fiscal policy can be very important indicator and maybe even more than interest rate policy. I beg to differ with both of these a little bit. They are still missing the game. Take the case of India. India, CPI inflation, CPI index, 45.86% is food. 45.86%, this is the highest amongst all G20 countries. It's an old weight based on 2011 consumption survey. Even if you correct it today, 23, 24, we have tried to look at how it has been falling over a period of time, it will still be about 38% or so. Now, food inflation, will your interest rate going up or down will be controlled? Will pumping in more money, you can protect the poor, that's one thing. You can give food subsidy, and India did give during this COVID period. It doubled, tripled, quite a bit of. But will fiscal policy as such be impacting inflation? There is a question mark, because everything affects everyone in a computable general equilibrium model, but what is the degree to which it affects? I recall about 6 months back, our edible oil inflation was running at 35%. 35%. And this is a country, by the way, if the overall inflation goes beyond 10%, you have deep political trouble. Even one commodity, onion prices in this country have unseated one government. I had the privilege to work with that Prime Minister at that time. Onion prices alone, it unseated the government of Mr. Vajpayee at that time. So overall inflation tolerance limit, I wonder how Pakistan or Sri Lanka or even Turkey or Argentina are coping with inflation rates that are unimaginable in this country. This country will be literally under massive social unrest if our inflation rate even crosses 15-20%. So our tolerance limit is 10%, and if you can keep at 5%, you are lucky and in pretty good shape. Now, why I bring this third element, monetary, fiscal, and the third element, policy instrument to tame inflation, is the trade policy. That has been not talked about because that's not the focus of your report as such. I'm giving you the example of edible oils, which was running at 35% inflation rate, and our import duties were at 60%. So he said, what are you doing? Global prices were rising, import duty is 60%, your own inflation rate is 35%, bring that down to 5% import duty. And luckily the government agreed. And today, inflation in edible oil is in negative zone. I can count commodity after commodity, whether it is wheat, whether it is rice, whether it is milk or anything, unless you look at the trade policy and the import-export policy of that, in particular food inflation, because we have import duty. Right now, milk. Would you know that within 1 year, Mother Dairy increased the milk prices by 5 times? Amul increased by 3 times. Milk alone, one commodity, the value of that is more than the value of rice plus wheat plus all the pulses plus sugarcane. And our inflation is rising. It has the highest weight in the CPI basket, but our import duty on skimmed milk powder, which is imported, is 60%. And on fat, the butter is 40%. You can easily control the price of this biggest commodity in CPI index by bringing down the duties to 10%, 15%. But that's where the political economy works. You can put export bans on wheat, but you can't lower the import duty on SMP. You have brought the import duty from edible oils from 60 to almost 0%, but milk lobby works in a different manner than other lobbies. That's where. So my submission, yes, I do agree. Monetary policy is important, so is fiscal policy, and therefore the Finance Ministry and the Reserve Bank of India in the Indian context have to work together, but both will miss the point unless they dovetail the trade policy in this puzzle of taming inflation. Rest, I think most of the other points that are made by Poonam particularly, that advanced economies are more out of gear than their targets. We are a little out of gear, but we can bear that. And I would give you one little example within the Indian context. During the UPA government, 10 years of Dr. Manmohan Singh's government, UPA government, average inflation rate in the country was 7.9%, average 7.9%. But the average growth rate was also 7.7%. And this is fascinating, and that's something, I'll come down to that point which IMF should look into more deeply. But NDA, the last 9 years of NDA government, Modi government, average inflation is 5.1%, and average GDP growth is 5.7%, 2 percentage points below. Inflation is low, but now what had happened? During the UPA government, the international prices from 4, 5 started increasing, and 7, 8, they peaked, and then they kept another peak in 11, 12, and then 13, 14, major peak. So we thought inflation is very bad for the poor. That's the normal understanding that we have. I was a part of the government at that time, and we did work out on what had happened, because the poverty data comes after a long time in India. For the last 10 years, we don't know what is poverty level. But we worked on the wages in the rural areas, farming wages, real wages, what is happening in the farming sector, non-farming rural sector, what is happening, because that's where the workers are and poorest of the lot is. The real wages were growing at 7% per annum. Real wages. So I remember when we put that thing out and it was discussed by the PM and others, it was amazing. Normally when inflation is increasing, the poor suffer most, but in the rural areas, real wages were increasing, and that's a period when you had the fastest decline in poverty in India between 2004, 5 and 11, 12, which was 3 times faster than during 93, 94 and 2004, 5. There is something interesting that happened during that period. Whereas during the NDA period today, there is a big debate going on. You must have seen 2 papers lately, one by Jane Drays and one by Surjit Bhalla, whether the real wages are increasing by 0.2% or 1.2% or 0.6%. They are talking about this. And what had happened during that period was a remarkably different experience. Overall, I think there is still a sort of a mystery that when inflation is imported in some of the emerging economies or developing economies of Africa and others for no fault of theirs, it is coming from the loose monetary policy or loose fiscal policies in the advanced economies, then at a global level, you can protect your people, but at a global level, what is the system of social safety nets? Africa in particular, I am seeing, they are suffering because they haven't distorted the world economy, but they are at the receiving end, and there is no way they can borrow the funds to protect their people. And that's the last thought I'll leave with the multilateral agency like IMF to think about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ashok. Very insightful. And let me just make one comment on this point about trade policy. I mean, it's absolutely on the dot. But let me also add that in a way, it was a low-hanging fruit for the government. But most countries in the world, the trade is much more liberalized, so they don't have that option. But on the dot on that point. And of course, distribution effects are really important. I really do want to give, of course, Marcos the opportunity to respond to the discussants, and I also have some comments, but I'm going to hold myself back, but I really want to hear from you and request you to not ask many questions, maybe one question or one comment if you want, but we are eager to hear from you, so hopefully we can take 2 or 3 questions at least. Please introduce yourself as you speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much, A.K. Jain. I am from the urban sector and briefly worked as consultant in the NCAER. All 3 presentations were masterpiece, no doubt about it. My question is to Marcos. The most vocal groups against inflation are the housewives and the pensioners. You have clubbed them under the segment of poor or the elderly. Is it not time to segregate them and focus more on those 2 groups, housewives and the pensioners, rather than clubbing them all together? This is the question.
Thank you very much. Any other? Yeah. There's one right here. There's one, yeah.
There is a likelihood of inflation declining continuously in a couple of months going forward. So in your view, when do you see inflation reaching? There is, so the Reserve Bank of India has a projection of 5.2% in FY24. Within the Monetary Policy Committee, there are few members who believe that 4% would be achievable in early FY25, like in April, May, June, first quarter. So do you agree with that view? And do you think that the present policy, the monetary policy rate, the repo rate, that is enough to bring inflation to 4%? So, thank you.
I think Charan had a question, right? There's one in the front row.
Sapna here from CNBC. Just want to ask Gulati sir specifically that how do you see this inflation trajectory in the next 6 odd months? 5.2 this year, RBI is saying 4% FY25, but you have some very important observations on the food part. And any specific suggestions, Gupta ma'am, if that has been taken up in the PMEAC? I mean, you can answer this informally also. I mean, not really for quoting or something, but just want to understand what is the status. Is it a worry or it's not? We are past, the storm is over, the worst is over, or can we expect something more? And second, on a more larger question, our fuel prices have been capped since April 6 last year. So at some point in time, that lid will come off, on the retail pricing part. So do you see that playing out in a major way in the Indian economy, or not really, because crude is now coming down? I mean, it's again complicated. So your views, but first on the food part. And milk, will they do something?
Thank you. Yeah, up in front row.
I thought this was an excellent presentation. And I think it's extending the knowledge frontier, bringing in fiscal. And I think this is a research which was waiting to happen. So thanks for bringing this in. So on the methodology, I wanted to check, what is the transmission lag that you have in mind? Are you taking the real interest rates also into consideration? And also, my own feeling is, are you focused on the monetized part of the debt? Because when you speak of inflationary implications of fiscal, are you tracing it through the monetized part, or what are you tracing it through? Finally, are the real interest rates being considered or not? And the long-term trend of inflation, what is the deviation from that? That will easily capture what Poonam was trying to say. Advanced countries, 30-year average is less than 2. In emerging countries, especially India, 30-year average is around 6. So that should be able to help and finalize this. Thank you.
We'll take a few more questions. I think we'll have to go a little beyond the scheduled time because we started a little bit late.
Hello, good morning everyone. I'm Shubham and I'm a research scholar at IIT Bombay. So I have a general question, like on the data related to inflation. Like recently we read articles which talk about shrinkflation. Like companies, they are quite reluctant to increase the prices, whereas they are reducing the quantity and keeping the price at the same level. So I have a question that the data related to inflation, are they capturing this shrinkflation effect?
My question is, considering the Fed has increased the rate to 5%, what I understand is that some of the banks in US are in trouble. They have already, 2-3 have already collapsed. It will have some kind of an indirect effect on Indian banks also. Maybe indirect, sentimental effect. So how do you see this situation?
Questions? No. Okay. So I'm going to request Marcos to answer questions that relate to the paper or any other international related questions. And then, of course, both Poonam and Ashok are such seasoned Indian experts. I'm going to ask them to handle the questions that they wish to. So go ahead.
Thank you so much, Ratna. So first of all, thank you so much for the discussion. Extremely rich and extremely so much information that we are going to bring to Washington and to discuss, and so many areas to look at. So this is our agenda more than a closed topic, and I can discuss actually a little bit what we are doing more in the IMF related to this agenda. So let me go very quickly because I don't want to spend much time, and I also want to give the India-related questions the opportunity for the professor to talk. So very interesting discussions, Poonam. Let me go to some of the items. So first, On the issue about like, you know, should fiscal policy, was there too much of a spending, and how fiscal policy like related to COVID led to inflation. We actually have a box in the chapter that discuss how COVID, particularly in advanced economies, could be seen as kind of a fighting war. In the tradition of Thomas Sargent analysis of like fiscal spending in wars led to hyperinflations and high inflations. Historically, we discussed that. And it's true that like a part of this spending in advanced economies to COVID, who had more space, advanced economies than emerging markets, is part of like the reason why we may have this inflationary topic. Now, on this particular issue, it's very important to understand that I go already to the point about how much advanced versus emerging markets we should use fiscal policy. I fully agree on the issue about the reorientation of fiscal policy in emerging markets and the consolidation of fiscal policy in advanced economies. So I think the difference between advanced economies and emerging markets on inflation were two. First of all, emerging markets were much more informed about the risks of inflation and reacted much faster as well, right? So they reacted much faster. As Ratna said, they had lower indexation as just showed. So the shock, even though they also faced a huge shock, I was in Africa when the shock started to appear, you know, has been less, as Poonam showed to us, than in advanced economies. In advanced economies, they took much longer, the central banks, to respond to that, and that's like an important difference. Now, on the question about what is the right target, should we keep the target of 2%? Should we go back to the target of like 4%? I think there are 2 points. So this is an open question yet, including our institutions, and I think there are 2 points connected to it. The first, which goes back to what Professor mentioned here, is what is the long-term interest rate, and like how much you want to keep the R star, the neutral interest rate in the long term, inflation in the long term, if you don't act. So that's a more like a structural question of like if we change our inflation target, are we accepting not only for now but for later having perhaps a larger neutral real interest rate, having a larger effect over time on this neutral long-term interest rate. That's a theoretical question. We have a discussion in the World Economic Outlook chapter about that. The second question, which is more discussed in the building, I think is one of the preoccupations when we talk about, you know, bring inflation to 2 or keep inflation at 4, is that this discussion is happening at the same time that you are trying to disinflate. So there is a credibility issue. I think that's the point that like keep us, you know, I fully agree that like what is 1 percentage point in inflation from 3 to 4, what's the impact? Perhaps not too big, but when the central bank in the middle of a disinflation effort tries to change the target of inflation, that may raise credibility issues. That would be definitely the case in Brazil, for example, where, you know, there is an open debate if the central bank independence should happen or should not happen. What is the level of the inflation target? So one of the concerns we have is exactly that concern of like, perhaps there is no big issue of like not going back to pre-COVID levels of target of inflation, but, you know, there is also the credibility issue that this could lead to if you change this in the middle of the effort of the disinflation. Then on the issue of like the connection of like, so is inflation acceptably high? I already discussed it. We also see that like we are still not even on that discussion yet, because in advanced economies, at least as Poonam showed in the charts, inflation are still very high. So we still have to bring to the 4 to then start discussing if you keep at 4 or if you bring at 2. They are still at like at 7, some places at 10, some places at 12. So let's bring before to 4, to 5, and then
have this discussion, which is an important discussion. On the relationship between public debt and inflation, actually this is something that I didn't discuss in my presentation, but we mentioned in the chapter. That's yet another reason why to use fiscal policy to help on the disinflation chapter, in the disinflation effort. If I use monetary policy and I raise interest rates, all of a sudden I have to pay a larger interest payment. All of a sudden this may actually lead to a very bad dynamics on my public debt. If I have a public debt that's already very high, 120, 130%, and I increase interest rates to 5%. Imagine the interest bill that an economy like that is facing, right? Fiscal policy has the opposite effect. You actually reduce automatically the debt by bringing the overall balance lower, right, or the overall deficit lower, the overall balance higher, and you don't have this effect. So this is yet another reason why fiscal policy can help. Is this an advanced economy or emerging market issue? It is true, it's a much more advanced economy, so I agree again on the reorientation part, but let's be also, clear that some of the fiscal policy in our emerging world can be more effective, right? So you can do a better quality. So and you asked about the legs of fiscal policy and how to do this fiscal policy adjustment when you have a 1 year cycle for fiscal policy. We can give clear examples when you are subsidizing. So the first one, I think, the WTO just mentioned that COVID is not an emergency anymore. So this COVID withdrawal, which we see in many countries, should be pursued to avoid these extra costs. Is the subsidies that are being given still relevant for the products that are being given? It depends. It depends on the product. It depends on the trade policy, as the Professor Gulati said. So some of the subsidies can be quickly withdrawn. Some of the current spending can be quickly withdrawn, right, without having the impact on public investment, which is so important for emerging markets, or without having the impact on the social assistance programs in the food assistance programs, for example. So there are ways that we can relatively quick use fiscal policy to reduce, to consolidate, or to reorient, as Poonam said, fiscal policy in emerging markets that could help these economies in being more effective and reaching the same level of growth, reaching the same objectives without having the effect of not growing and not helping the most poor. So question about, so reorientation, I already said. The question about the countries with very high inflation, Argentina and Turkey, was a very interesting point. We actually thought when writing the chapter about writing a box about these economies. I mean, I that lived through hyperinflation to at least 4 years of my life, these are so different dimensions, such a different way that you live in an economy with 100% inflation per year, with 100% inflation a month, as I lived, that we thought this doesn't really talk to the points we want to make here. We could discuss, and we can discuss Turkey, Argentina in an entire chapter, an entire report. But there's a very different situation. Their inflation is persistent. There is one thing that I always mention when you are in a crowd of advanced economies is once inflation becomes persistent, the logic actually inverts completely, right? So actually financial markets learn how to deal with inflation. So the richest are protected from inflation all of a sudden. So the net creditors that I mentioned here, they're going to have financial products to protect themselves against inflation. So so that's why we didn't touch on that particular issue. I discussed a little bit the conceptual aspects of fiscal policy. On Professor Gulat, so I really so why not studying Asia? We actually had a bit later data for Malaysia and Thailand, and we had a big discussion should we make the effort, and we are actually doing now that. So we thought unfortunately didn't give time to present those at the time of the report, but we are actually doing analysis for Malaysia and Thailand as we speak to bring more this Asian aspect, even though I agree that it looks relatively similar to the low-income countries, including their share of baskets. I think Professor's points on the trade policy are extremely well taken. You know, my only point here is like this is in the border between trade and fiscal policy, right? These import duties are there for trade reasons. These import duties help me as a government to keep my debt constant, right? So when I talk about fiscal policy, I could see also these type of instruments actually being used at first, and I think Professor made a fantastic case for it, rather than eliminating subsidies in assistance programs. So let's look at all the aspects of like a tax policy and revenue policy. Let's look at import duties. Let's look like the subsidies, and let's make like why to keep the 60% on milk if you are having these high prices, okay? Final point, so other points. On the housewives and pensioners, thank you for the question. So I didn't mention this as well. We do have a paragraph where we mention, we could have done more exercise on that, Saratina, but we do mention the gender aspects of inflation. The fact that like a gender, inflation tends to affect mostly women, housewives, and like a woman like that are alone. So there are a couple of papers, recent papers looking to that. So households led by women are normally more affected than households led by men through the inflationary shock. So we mentioned this, we mentioned the literature, we could do much more work on that, I agree. On the pensioners, we have the indexation, the discussion, we have the distributive, we could do more. There is the issue about old and young. Very careful there to not discuss like, look, these are, the point is about old, rich old net creditors, not the poor pensioners that like actually are in the perhaps in the lowest quintile. So I think hopefully this is clear. And so my only point about so on the global level, that's also another important thing. So two aspects that we are looking right now in the IMF about inflation is one is like this global level of like inflation. So we are trying to understand how many countries are adjusting at the same time, how this can affect globally countries through financial tightening, but also like are we not overdoing it by having everybody at the same time raising interest rates? So far the view in the institutions like we are not, like real interest rates are still very low, so it makes sense to have like this tightening, combined tightening across the world, but we are doing research on that and we are trying to understand what is the aspects. On the financial banks, to my second comment, very important aspect. Of course, we are very worried with the situation. The discussion in the building is like, there are tools to deal with inflation, that's interest rates. There are tools to deal with financial sector issues, which are regulation, which are like macroprudential measures. Ratina knows so well this topic much better than me. And you know, these central banks, they have these separate tools. But we have to be careful. And we are trying to understand much more this interplay between raising interest rates and banking sector. My only point on India, just to give like the forecast of the IMF, the IMF in the last World Economic Outlook had an estimate of inflation for India, overall inflation, 6.7, going down to 2023 to 4.9, so below 5, and reaching over the medium term 4%. Okay, now this for India and for the US and Poonam, to make the point on Poonam, these are all assuming active policies of like a rising interest rates and keeping interest rates at that level. So yes, forecast for inflation is going down, but they are going down because we are keeping rates higher for longer. So let's make sure that like, that this forecast materialize and that we have like a lower inflation going down. Thank you so much.
Marcos, thanks very much. You've answered the questions very comprehensively and very patiently. Before we turn to the India-specific questions, I just wanted to say a couple of things just for your consideration in the future. So one is, of course, completely agree that monetary and fiscal policy needs to go hand in hand from a macro stability perspective and the growth perspective. But I still find it a little hard to understand how fiscal policy can be inflationary and sustained. Inflation is price increase and sustained without some monetary accommodation, So that is hard for me to, like, conceptually, theoretically grasp. I don't want you to answer my questions, but I just wanted to say that. The other two things that just to keep in mind is, it's interesting that you find that wages kept pace with inflation in some countries, but not others during COVID. And the explanation, the chapter gives is, breaking it up by commodity exporters and importers. But when I look at the countries, you know what I think it is, and I've done many papers on high inflation and fiscal deficit, I really think it is about countries with a history of very high inflation, basically Latin American countries, where indexation and catch-up happens much faster. So just for your consideration, I don't think it has to do with commodity exports. And the final point is, you talk about pressure to index may increase, obviously with rising inflation, but fortunately or unfortunately, I'm not taking sides, but the labor unions have become much weaker across the world over time. So for the policymakers, it's kind of good news. I mean, it's not as good news for people with low income. Let me now turn to Poonam first, and then Ashok, but to answer only the India-specific questions.
So the presentation were the views of the IMF. What I discussed were not even the views of NCER, let alone PMEAC. So I kept saying, I have done that. I didn't even acknowledge the team which helped me do that. So my response is personal, right? In my capacity as somebody who has worked on these issues. So I think the questions which were referred to me were twofold. One was inflation. The projections given by the RBI, are they reasonable? Will they be achieved? Is this the right way to think about it? So, the gist of today's conversation was that inflation is a function of many things, and there are many policy tools which have been deployed and can be deployed to address inflation. Food prices matter, indexation matters, inflationary expectations matter. If you take into account all of those factors, both in an intertemporal sense and certainly in comparison to other countries, inflation seems range-bound and anchored in India. It never accelerated to the levels that we have seen in many other countries which have had bigger challenges with inflation, Latin America, more range-bound than advanced economies. So inflation has, for the past many years, as Dr. Gulati said, has not been India's problem. So whether it will settle exactly at 4, 4.25, 4.5 is anybody's guess. But I guess when you are trying to anchor inflationary expectations, then 4% is a good forecast than any other number. Can things change in any direction? Certainly. And one part of the discussion today was, if it's a little bit higher, so what? As Dr. Gulati said, periods of slightly higher inflation have been the periods of higher growth as well, and this is what Marcos agreed with as well. On banking sector, actually, so India has come out of a decade-long banking crisis, and just on the eve of the pandemic, it had also cleaned up an NBFC crisis. So Indian financial sector, banks and non-banks, are currently quite resilient. And fortunately, pandemic has not really posed a big challenge for the sector, primarily because interest rate hikes have not been as aggressive as in the US. Public debt, the yields on public debt are fixed, or a large part of it is fixed. It does not move with the market, right? So that will be another point which will insulate it. And Indian banks are not actually directly have any direct transmission from the US banks. So banking and non-bank sector is pretty resilient at this point in time. And I think I'll stop here.
Thanks very much, Poonam. Excellent points. Ashok, do you want to take a couple of minutes?
Well, if I knew what the price situation is going to be, I should be a billionaire, betting on commodity futures. But on a more serious note, I think RBI's projection between 5 to 6%, 5.4 or so, it's very much achievable, subject to normal rainfall. And that is becoming somewhat a question mark right now as we talk about. And the revised forecast of IMD, we have to wait whether El Nino is going to be stronger than the Indian Ocean dipole, because there is a tug of war between the Indian Ocean dipole and the El Nino. And if we analyze 100 years, all drought years are El Nino years, but all El Nino years are not drought years. If there is a drought, then there could be a pressure on prices, but under normal situation, even if there is a drought, and if we play our buffer stocking policy and trade policy more aggressively, I feel we can contain inflation below 6%. And in fact, in a normal monsoon, if we are proactive on buffer stocking and trade, we can actually bring it down below 5%. And I can give you number of commodity examples what needs to be done right away. The cereal group, there are 299 commodities in CPI. And I gave you the example of milk, which has the highest weight as an individual commodity. But cereals as a group otherwise has the highest weight. Now within cereals, rice, the buffer stocks are 2.5 times more than the buffer stock norm. You unload 3 million, 5 million, 7 million, you can bring down prices wherever you want them to be. Wheat prices, which only 2 months back were at 25% rate of inflation. And we looked at commodity by commodity. We said, you are sitting on 3 million tons extra buffer stock. Why don't you unload? And when government acted on that, between January to March, the wholesale price has already fallen from 2,800 a quintal to 2,100, 2,200. And the CPI will follow now within a month or 2 months lag, and you will find wheat inflation collapsing, which is still at 19%, CPI inflation. But WPI has drastically come down because of the buffer stocking unloading. So if you use the buffer stocking policy wisely and trade policy, you have a lot of scope because our import tariffs are very, very high. This is the right time. We can play with that. So if I was to act right now under normal rainfall, I can bring it down to below 5%, but even if the rainfall is a little here or there, we can contain it at 6%. Thank you.
Thanks, Ashok. Really reflects your in-depth knowledge of the economy and experience. So let me bring this to a conclusion. I want to thank Marcos for his really excellent presentation, but it's not just the presentation, it stimulated such fantastic discussion from the discussants and of course from the audience. So I want to sincerely thank Poonam and Ashok also, but also the audience for making this a very, very, very interesting and rich discussion. So thank you very much.
Many thanks to Ratna for so skillfully anchoring it. Thank you. Please join us for tea. Actually, it's high tea in the atrium, please. Thank you.